Again, thank you for joining us. This is our fifth gathering with IO, and we are looking at the Uprooting Inequity, session 5, and the racialization of Asian American theme. As you all know, that equity, diversity, and inclusion are an active process that require continuous commitment to promoting equity-minded practitioners, and that we are building healthy communities, ensuring overall success of our present and future generation. For those who have joined us prior, as we know, this is a build up to our Seminar 7, where we can take a look at ways of moving the needle around equity and justice. We are excited for that to happen, but I think we as IO shares more of the background and information that will help us all identify moving the needle. And let's see here. For the folks who are just joining us, welcome. The other 4 sessions are on our website under the events. All the agenda, the recording, and the PowerPoint that IO has graciously shared are within the seminars on the website. So again, thank you for coming. My name is Onar Primitivo. I currently serve as the Executive Director of Equity and Justice in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I will now read our land acknowledgement as we begin our time together. And again, thank you. So local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backwards, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century, and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of our campus, or a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane. By day, you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity, making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. And also, as part of our reflection, there are these 2 questions that we would like you to just really ingrain as we move through our seminar. What intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? What is your organization doing beyond, and what are you doing beyond acknowledging whose land and labor allow you to live, work, and or learn in that space? So those are the challenge and that's some nuggets. So we know that we have some community guidelines for you all, as this is a space to provide UC Merced foundations needed to astutely build an anti-racist strategy. Our campus is set to and will grow. As we do, we will weave the values of equity, diversity, and inclusion within academic affairs, student affairs, our business units, our organizational decision-making, and again, that vibrancy of our campus from radical transformation to radical thinking. You are critical in this transformative work. Discussion of racism, it's pervasive. How it shows up in your day, you're extremely difficult. To help you process today's concept, please honor the following guidelines. Share the airspace, right? One diva, one mic. And again, engagement. Let's keep that moving forward. It was phenomenal within the last couple of seminars. So let's do that again. Of course, reflection is critical, right? Reflection is always key when we learn something new and how that impacts us and how we can infuse that. So hence, participate in the chat. Process, whether at home, in chat, in discussion with our OEDI staff. We love to have these conversations with you all, and again, and with others, right? And then also the last is going to, the goal is to bring us the reflection back to our daily practice and drive session 7. And session 7 is all of the journey in that is identifying ways, again, to move that equity forward. So now I'm just going to, for the new folks, just share a little bio for Ayo. Ayo Magwood Uprooting Inequity LLC is an educational consultant specializing in in-depth based education on the history, economics, sociology, and cognitive psychology of structural racism. She also equips institutions with the tools and strategies to foster more productive conversation about racism using her perspectives consciousness approach. Her pro-equity model is a K through 12 instructional approach for teaching an inclusive and critical, honest curriculum that also fosters perspective consciousness, civic skills and dispositions, and shared we identity. She has over 10 years of classroom experience in both majority low-income Black Latino charter schools and a majority high-income white private schools. Ayo has a BA in economics and international relations from Brown University and a master's in applied economics from Cornell University. And I turn it to you, Ayo.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few additional logistics and expectations. Most of you are familiar with these. It's the same ones from last times. Write your clarifying questions in the chat and someone will communicate them to me. I'm not going to check the chat until the breaks, but feel free to communicate with other participants. The material is dense and complex, so I strongly encourage you to use active learning strategies such as note-taking, asking questions, and discussion, rather than just listening, which is passive learning. You don't learn, learn as much, you don't process as much, and you don't retain as much. Please take notes using the outline that's provided in the Word doc. It's both on the website and also it was dropped in the chat, the link. You can just download it as a Word doc. And then you can just add your notes in between the headers of the outline. Please share your thoughts in the chat when I request at the end of the workshop. This allows us to hear all the voices in the room. I strongly encourage 100% participation. And we're going to have 4 2-minute brain breaks, 30 seconds to rest your brain, 90 seconds for active processing in our notes. And this is what the outline looks like, and this is where it's located. And like I said, also in the chat, so just download it as a Word doc. So just a reminder, you only remember 10% of what you read and 20% of what you hear, but 70% of what you say and write. So this is the 5th workshop or seminar in the series. It's a short history of Asian racialization or Asian American racialization. So the agenda for today was, we're just like last time with Latinx racialization, we're going to do an overview of Asian demographics, looking at data mostly from the US Census. Then we'll go back and to the roots of Asian racialization, yellow peril during the late 19th century, California with the Chinese immigrants. Then we're going to look at how Asian racialization is differentiated based on skin color, xenophobia, and class. And we're going to see how marginal groups often attain honorary whiteness by engaging in Black-brown racism, or with the case of Asians, they weren't actually engaging in the racism themselves, but being used by conservatives to engage in anti-Black or anti-brown racism. This is called racial mascotting. And the status of Asians as honorary whites, we're going to see is deceptive. It masks both huge inequities within the Asian community, as well as continuing racism. And we're going to see that the status of Asians as honorary whites is precarious. It tends to disappear. It tends to collapse every single time there's a national crisis. And finally, the sort of conclusion is xenophobia, including anti-Asian xenophobia and racism, has to be addressed systemically. So let's look at the demographics first. First, some definitions I'm going to be using. So East Asia refers to, I'm not going to name all the countries in the area, but some of the main countries where we have the largest populations. When we say East Asians, we're referring to Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Korean. When we refer to South Asians, we're referring to Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan. And when we're referring to Southeast Asian, referring to Vietnam, Laos, including the Hmong, who are an ethnic group within Laos, and Cambodians, Thais, and the Philippines. Last time we saw some maps about where different racial groups are located. So this was Asian, Black, Hispanic, Black, Asian, and American Indian. And last time we noted that there is some overlap between where Asians are located in the country and where there's also concentration of Hispanics. So let's look at the Asian map a little bit closer up. And so we can see the areas where there's concentrations. And we can see the population of the different groups. So the size of the box indicates roughly the relative size of that Asian group in the United States. And so on the left here, we have the East Asian populations and people of East Asian heritage. In the middle, we have people of South Asian heritage. And on the right, we have people of Southeast Asian populations. And we can see that the biggest ones are Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, and Filipinos. And here we can see where different Asian ethnicities are concentrated. So this is a map of the primary Asian population in that state. So you can see Indians in the green, Chinese in the beige, Filipinos in the purple, and let's see what else, Vietnamese in the light green. Again, this is just the biggest population in the state. Of course, there's a diversity of groups within each state. It just gives you an idea of where the concentrations are. And here's California. We have a close-up here. So this is by, majority groups, by ethnicity, by congressional district. And we can see the major populations within California are Filipino at 3.9%, Chinese at 3.6% of the population, of California population, Vietnamese 1.7%, Indian at 1.5%, Korean at 1.3%, and Japanese at 1.1%. And this includes those with partial Asian ancestry. The Asian population is assumed to be the largest immigrant group in the US, surpassing Hispanics. This is projected. And this is the percent who are foreign born, meaning first generation. We can see that most Asian adults in the US are foreign born, 78% versus 47% of Hispanics. And it varies a lot by Asian origin group. So here's some of the main Asian groups. 68% of Indians are first generation or foreign born. Roughly 60% of Vietnamese, Chinese, and Koreans are foreign born, and roughly half of Filipinos in the United States are foreign born or first generation. And 27% of Japanese. Asian Americans lead others in other races in both education and income. So this is the percent with a bachelor's degree, college degree, or more among those who are 25 or older. This data is a little dated. It's from 2010, but relative, you can still see the huge gap. So roughly 50% of Asians have a college degree versus 31% of whites, 18% of Blacks, and 13% of Hispanics. Income, same huge difference, of course, because income is often a factor of education. You can see a big difference in median household income, again for 2010, slightly dated. And this is partly because Asian immigrants are more likely to come in with a high level of education, even before they come to the United States. So this is a chart of the share of recent immigrants. So recent immigrants refer to those who came to the United States within the past 3 years. So that's too soon to have gotten a college degree, right? 3 years. And you can see that a much higher percent of Asian immigrants come to the country already with a college degree, 61% versus 30% of other immigrants. So that explains a lot of it. It's not only the educational attainment once they come to the country, but the fact that they're coming in very highly educated. And part of this also is because Asians make up a big percent of international students. But there's a huge span. There's a lot of variation. So you can see, for example, there's very high levels of education, of college attainment for Indians, Malaysians, Korean, Pakistanis, Chinese, again, most more East Asian. And you can see the huge difference compared to, for example, a lot of Southeast Asians, the Hmong and Burmese, those from Laos, have much lower levels. So that high percentage for Asians overall is masking huge variations within the educational levels of different groups. And similarly, there's a huge variations among the median household. That very high average is masking a very wide diversity of income levels. Again, similarly between mostly, I'm generalizing a bit, but more East Asians tend to have the higher levels. Again, they're coming in with high levels of education versus the Southeast Asians. And in fact, the inequality gap within the Asian community is the highest. The difference between high earners, Asian earners, and low Asian earners is much wider than that for white, Blacks, or Hispanics. And this has partly to do with when that immigrant group mostly came in. So we talked about last time with the Latinx that immigrant groups come in oftentimes because of the geopolitics of the United States and what the foreign policy priorities for the United States. So we can really see that here we have the highest earning, the skills or high skilled Pakistani, Chinese, Indians, Bangladeshi, and Japanese. And most of these are coming in, have come in more recently since the 1980s, 1990s. And a lot of them are coming in on the H-1B visa program for high earning immigrants to the United States, or as students, as foreign students going to college or grad school, versus over here with the Southeast Asians, lowest skilled. They're coming in mostly as political refugees from the Cold Wars in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, where we fought wars, and so we are the United States feels obligated to take in refugees, and so that's why there's a big percentage of immigration flows from those countries. But the different reasons why they come to the United States, it correlates with the differences in educational levels and income levels. And I mentioned the H-1B visa. So it's a visa that allows specialized foreign workers into the United States for skills that United States workers cannot supply on their own. So it's heavily weighted towards STEM. Software developers represent 38% of the occupations. So of these, you can see that Indians and Chinese make up a total of, Asians in general make up about 75% of those who receive H-1B visas. So very highly skilled and very high, well-paid jobs. Of course, oftentimes there's a wage differential. Oftentimes those with H-1B visas get paid less than American counterparts doing the same jobs. But still, compared to the other immigrants, it's still a higher level income. Okay, so that is that first part. I'm going to go ahead and set the alarm for 2 minutes, and we can.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so in our next section, we're going to go back to look at the roots of Asian racialization. We're going to go all the way back to the late 19th century. For much of this seminar, I've relied heavily on two books that I highly recommend. Both have the same author, historian Erica Lee. And the first one, The Making of the Asian American, is 2015. And America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, is dated from 2019. However, she did add a postscript to both of them, updating them with the latest information about the anti-Asian violence in 2020 and 2021. The second book, America for Americans, won, as you can see, all of these awards on the right. I apologize. So again, I'm going to remind you that I'm going to use the same definition as last time. So when we say racialization, racialization is how society and the state assign individuals to racial groups and the relative position of groups to each other. And so that and that entails, we've seen a dynamic process. It keeps on changing, and there's a relationship. I apologize. It involves a constantly iterative process. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to pause for a second.
Take a pause. Thank you for your patience, everyone.
I apologize, I'm back. I just got something stuck in my throat. I had to run and get some water. Okay, so we've learned that it's both a process of society and the state assigning a group to a relative position in the racial hierarchy, and also in response, the group themselves, either as a group or individuals or subgroup, negotiating or contesting that position. And so it's a dynamic process that continues going. And it's not just also the position, but also, of course, the rights and privileges associated to that position and the stereotypes associated with that position, okay? So that's what we're looking at today. We're looking at the history of how Asians have been and are racialized, okay? So and just like with, you remember with Mexicans, with Latinos, we found out that the roots of Latinx racialization go back to history, to how Mexicans specifically were treated and seen, and how Mexicans fit into the US racial hierarchy. So it's similar with, we're going to see that it's similar for Asians. We're going to find out that in many ways, the racial script or narrative or template for Asians was the Chinese, because they were the first Asians to come to the United States. But first, some quick definitions about xenophobia. So this is from America for Americans. Although xenophobia is often loosely characterized as individual prejudice, animosity, or bias towards foreigners, it is in fact much more. It is an ideology, a set of beliefs and ideas based on the premise that foreigners are threats to the nation and its people. It promotes an irrational fear and hatred of immigrants and demonizes people considered to be foreign, meaning not just the first generation immigrants, but even many generations later who are still considered to be foreign. It is born from a narrow and exclusive definition of who is American and who is not. Native Americans and African Americans were, of course, the country's first others, and xenophobia was forged by Americans' enslavement of Africans, the seizure of indigenous land and resources, and the removal or elimination of indigenous people. How immigrants have fit into this racial environment of white settlers, Black slaves, and indigenous peoples has shaped Americans' attitudes towards them. If you were here last time with the seminar on Latinx racialization, remember it was the same thing, right? It was a very similar process of how they tried to, Anglo-Americans tried to figure out how Mexicans fit into this framework with a racial hierarchy of whites, Blacks, and indigenous people. It was a similar sort of process with the Chinese. Yet certain types of foreignness have always been considered more threatening than others. Race is the single most important factor in determining which foreigners are targeted for xenophobic discrimination and which ones are not. This is because xenophobia is a form of racism. It defines certain groups as racial and religious others who are inherently inferior or dangerous, or both, and demonizes them as a group. And xenophobia has also been an inextricable part of race making in America. It has shaped how Americans classify people by race and rank them in America's racial hierarchy. Lastly, xenophobia has become an institutionalized form of racial discrimination and racial domination. We're going to come back more to this point a little bit later on. As a form of racial discrimination, xenophobia has not distinguished between immigrants who have entered with authorization and those who have not, or between immigrants and second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation citizens. And again, we saw this also in the Latinx seminar, right? So again, the roots of Asian racialization is in the yellow peril xenophobia around Chinese immigrants in the late 19th century California. So I'm quoting from an earlier book on a history of Asian Americans, Strangers from a Different Shore. It's a classic by Ronald Takaki. It's a little dated by now, 1998. So I did not rely on it for the seminar, but he had a great quote. As the first Asian group to enter America, the Chinese merit our close attention. What happened to them in the 19th century represented the beginning of a pattern for the ways Asians would be viewed and treated here up until today. Their transformation into strangers. Some scholars talk about, refer to a racial script or a racial narrative or racial template. And once that template is formed, then it gets applied to all the other Asians, for example, in this case, similar to how the Mexican racial script or racial template got applied to all the Latinx afterwards. But their identity as outsiders was determined not only by their entry, but also by a complex combination of economic, ideological, and political developments in American society. So we can see that racialization has a lot to do with economic and political developments. For example, you might recall this graph from our very first seminar. You remember in Origins of Race and Racism. So we talked about how, in that workshop, I was talking about how the stereotypes, the anti-Black stereotypes, were very much in response to and to justify and rationalize economic incentives. And I said it was very similar with Chinese immigrants, you might recall. So in the 1850s, Chinese immigrants were hired, and 1860s as well, Chinese immigrants were hired to work in gold mines, potentially taking jobs from white laborers. And if you look at the primary sources from the time, newspapers and politicians' speeches, Chinese immigrants are depicted as being depraved and vicious, gross gluttons, bloodthirsty and inhuman. Just one decade later, during the 1860s, Chinese immigrants were hired to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, especially the portion over the mountains, which was very dangerous. They could not get white laborers to work on that section. That section was almost completely Chinese laborers. Not only were they cheaper, but like I said, they were willing to work on that very dangerous section of the railroad, at which white laborers were unwilling to do. That was for 6 years. During that time, if you look at the primary sources, Chinese immigrants are depicted as sober, industrious, law-abiding, very trusty, very intelligent. As soon as the Transcontinental Railroad was built, finished, then we no longer had any use for Chinese immigrants. And then they were again competition. And the Irish led the campaign against them. And suddenly in the primary sources, Chinese immigrants are being depicted as criminal, conniving, crafty, and stupid. So you can really see how the racial stereotypes, the racial script and racialization of Chinese at the time and later Asians really is often a reflection of, as I'm going to go back to Takaki's note, but their identity as outsiders was determined not only by their entry, but also by a complex combination of economic, ideological, and political developments in American society. So we can really see that. And we're going to see more about the political developments in a minute. So the first Chinese immigrants came in during the gold rush. And I just to contextualize it, the gold was discovered in California less than a year after we invaded Mexico and took 1/3 of their land, and all those Mexican citizens became American. So it was only a year later, just for context. And so at the same time that this was during empire building, right? And this is the same time that we were taking over the land of indigenous people, and at the same time that slavery was going on, and the same time that we were taking away land from Mexican Americans. So the Chinese came to participate in the gold rush. At first, the Anglos didn't have a problem with them, but as soon as they started having trouble finding gold, then all of a sudden the resentment started growing against the Chinese. But pretty soon after that, by 1863, they started the Transcontinental Railroad. Because remember, again, this was right soon after we had taken over most of this land in the West, and so the idea was this is part of manifest destiny. We're going to build a railroad to basically conquer all this land. So before this, we had to use the Pony Express for land, and they had to have caravans, like people who were traveling out to get to California, for instance, the gold rush. They had to go in caravans, and which was very dangerous and took a long time. But through this railroad, then it would facilitate the movement of people. It would facilitate us taking over the land from the indigenous people. It also even facilitated us killing all of the buffalo, because they would actually, the hunters would actually hang on to the train and shoot the buffalo. And so I think it's important, this context is important of the role that this railroad played in manifest destiny and taking away and the disposition of Indians, Native Americans. But anyhow, the Transcontinental Railroad had two parts. As you can, they started at the same time at both ends in Omaha, and went out west, the red line, and then they started in Sacramento, the blue line, and went east. And then they met in the middle at Promontory Summit. The reason why the
blue is much shorter is because it took that much longer, because going over the Sierra Nevada mountains was a great feat. It was very dangerous. They had to go up in the mountains. They would stick dynamite into the cracks in the mountain and then and blow it up to try to get into it. So this was the part that was very dangerous. The part that's in red, that was mostly white immigrants, Irish. They had no problem pretty much getting laborers on that end. But the blue part, they could not get white laborers. And so it ended up being built mostly by Chinese immigrants. So here we have some photos. And by the way, on the bottom right, you can really appreciate that they're trying to build tunnels through just mountains, just rocks there, boulders that had to be, they had to dynamite their way through there. It's extremely dangerous. And they got paid a pittance, of course. And by the way, to add insult to injury, so this is at the point where the two sides of the road meet at promontory, what's it called? Sacramento, Promontory Summit. You can see the two railroads trains are meeting each other. And this is where they put in the golden spike, so-called golden spike, to join the rails. And this is a celebratory picture. This is a formal marketing picture. There's not a single Chinese immigrant in the photo. Very intentionally, of course. And then after the Transcontinental Railroad ended, then we had no use for the Chinese immigrants. And so this is the birth of 1869. This is when the quote unquote Chinese question came up, is what should we do with the Chinese? There was a lot of, this is when things started to get really rough. This is when a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment built up. And by the way, not a lot, but this was also around the same time that the 13th Amendment had passed, slavery was abolished. And so some, at least, of the Chinese came down to the South and took over and worked in the fields, in the plantations down South, especially Mississippi and in Louisiana, two biggest places. It wasn't a lot because they still had contract leasing, but there was some. It's just interesting connection. We're going to look more at connections between the groups next time. So this is where we see the really rabid anti-Chinese xenophobia start to grow. And we'll see that the stereotypes that developed during this time are the main stereotypes for not just the Chinese, but all Asians, even continuing today. We can still see them. As we go through these, I want you to think about how they still persist today in many ways. So here is sort of like an overview. We have cheap labor, right? They're unfair competition. The Pakapu and the Fantan are gambling, immorality, and then diseases, smallpox, typhoid, opium, bribery, and customs robbery, and also the stereotypes of the phenotype. And I apologize ahead of time that these cartoons are extremely offensive, but I think it's important for us to learn to know the history so that we can see it today. So I have several of the main stereotypes during that time. So one is the Chinese as spreaders of dangerous infectious diseases. Do you see where this is going? Just in case you had hint, 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 pandemic, right? COVID-19, right? So, in that case, it was malaria, smallpox, leprosy, that were associated with Chinatown. And in fact, also, this is, in fact, the script for the Chinese immigrants and also the Mexican immigrants in some ways is the immigrant or xenophobic stereotypes. You can see variations. Many immigrant groups have also been accused of the same thing, of carrying dangerous infectious diseases, but I would say the Chinese and thus the Asians more so. A second related stereotype was of Chinese as dirty, unhygienic, disease-ridden, and as very specifically as rat eaters, and the rats being one of the sources of these infectious diseases. Of course, there was zero recognition of the racism and discrimination and the immigration policies and laws that forced Chinese to live in such conditions. Somehow it's their fault. The conditions don't get blamed on the policies and practices, but rather on some inherent inferiority of them. And of course, this is very common. You see the same thing with Blacks and Latinos and poor people in general, low-income people even today, right? It's always that same pattern. There's policies and practices and discrimination that cause poverty and inhumane conditions, and then it gets blamed on the people themselves as inherent characteristics. You guys are blowing up the chat. I can't wait to see it. A third sort of set of bucket of stereotypes was of the Chinese as immoral, violent, drug addicted, criminal, racially inferior, and just completely incapable of assimilation and completely incapable of ever becoming an American. So fundamentally foreign, and not just as in foreign as in their situation, their immigrant status, but rather as a people, as a race. So again, you see that today, right? There's the forever foreigner stereotype. So even you see today Asians and also Latinx who are second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh generation are still seen as foreign. Where are you really from? Where are you from, right? I'm sure many people get it. I know I get it. And then the fourth set of stereotypes is the idea of the Chinese as an unarmed foreign invasion that would overrun the United States and displace whites. And again, you see that stereotype with a lot of immigrant groups, but definitely with the Chinese. Here, this is called the Other Statue of Liberty, and it's a Chinese man who's you can see he's holding up an opium pipe. He's in rags, and his foot is on a skull. There's rats at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, and it's the idea that he's going to overrun and that these are foreign hordes that are going to invade the United States and displace whites. Of course, ironically, at the very same time, whites were displacing indigenous people. And then a final stereotype, which is also very recognizable of Chinese undercutting white workers' wages, taking away American jobs, and undermining the economy. And of course, every single immigrant group is accused of this, right? I love this saying. When I heard it, it was the name of a chapter in one of the books: Chinese needed but not wanted. And it's the same thing again with other immigrants group. At the time, Chinese businesses, including the railroads and corporations, actively, very aggressively campaigned and worked to bring Chinese immigrants here because we needed them. And but of course, they're not wanted. Their labor is wanted, but their presence is not wanted. Or I should say, the labor is needed, but their presence is not wanted here as humans, as being just their labor. It should be invisible and not have any effect. And of course, the anger is not against the corporate of the white workers. It's not against the corporations or the business people, but rather against the immigrants. So this led to a series of this anti-Chinese violence and hate led to a series of our very first U.S. immigration laws. So it's really telling that our very first U.S. immigration laws were race-based, were racist. They were targeted to Chinese and later on all Asians. So in 1875, the Page Act targeted women, Chinese women, and so that is why most of the immigrants were men only. The 1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended immigration. It wasn't very effective. There was lots of undocumented immigration through the so-called paper sons. People would pretend to be the son of somebody living a Chinese person living in California, and give papers as if they were their son. They called them paper sons because they were son in paper only. However, it was only lasted for 10 years, but it was extended several times. And it didn't end until finally into 1943. And that was for the first time Chinese were permitted to become naturalized citizens. So not only did they allow more Chinese in, but they finally were allowed to be naturalized citizen. 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act was in effect ended all immigration from Asia. And so it wasn't until 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act. We see a huge increase, a substantial increase in Asian immigration after the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. But also we see that this Hart-Celler Act had a strong preference for immigrants based on immigrant skills, meaning highly educated. So we find that most Asians that come in after 1965, excepting the political refugees that resulted from our war making in the Cold War, the proxy Cold Wars against communism, in the Southeast Asia. Aside from them, from immigrants coming from those countries, since then, most Asians that come in are very highly educated, have high immigration skills because of our immigration policy. But you can really see, like I've mentioned several times, you can really see how the very same arguments are used against each immigrant group. So here in the first panel on the top left, 1780, Papist immigrants, that means Papist is from the Pope. So that was a synonym for Catholic. What they mean is Catholic immigrant. Catholic immigrants, they're referring mostly to Irish. The Irish are wrecking our economy with their fecundity. That means they're having too many children. We must erect a wall of brass around the country for the exclusion of Catholics. Again, mostly Irish. The wall of brass is quoted from John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So a brass, a wall, right? Erect a wall. 1850 on the top right, Chinese immigrants refuse to assimilate. And if we let too many in, they'll undermine our economy. Down here on the left, bottom left, 1920. Now, I've got nothing against Jews, but the Jews are coming in huge numbers. The economy can't take it. And then bottom right, we've got nothing against Mexicans, but they refuse to assimilate. They're ruining our economy. We should erect a wall. History marches on. Nativism marches in place. So we can really see the parallels in the same scripts, the same anti-immigrant scripts being used over and over again over time. This is why it's important to learn history, identify these patterns. Also, it's important to note that the main group who were against the Chinese, those who were really pushing and leading the anti-Chinese immigration movement were the Irish. And what's fascinating is, as you saw in that cartoon, the Irish had faced much of the exact same attacks and stereotypes not that long ago, right? Not that long before the Chinese. And so they turned around and used the same arguments and the same stereotypes against the Chinese. And they really were pushing it. They really were at the front, the Irish of this movement. And that is not a coincidence. The Irish became white by using the anti-Chinese movement and also the anti-Black and now also anti-Black racism to prove their whiteness, to become white. This is from America for Americans by Erica Lee. Vulnerable themselves to charges that they were racially inferior, Irish Americans often used anti-Black racism as a way to prove their whiteness. So that, especially in the East Coast, and a little earlier on. Then the Irish moved to the West and did the same thing against the Chinese. But what was significantly different in anti-Chinese rhetoric was the explicit grouping of all European immigrants, all whites, as full Americans, real Americans. as California lawmakers and anti-Chinese spokespeople, many of whom were Irish or Irish Americans, argued the Chinese were a threat to our own people, who they defined as the original settlers of California, along with their children and recent immigrants from East and Europe, meaning including the Irish. By using this definition, anti-Chinese politicians conveniently ignored African Americans, Mexican Americans, and the hundreds of indigenous nations. But they also unambiguously included all European immigrants, all whites, as our own people. The anti-Chinese and later the anti-Japanese movements argued that distinction should be made between the Europeans and the Asians rather than among European immigrants. So the xenophobes thus expanded the boundaries of whiteness while advocating for Asian exclusion. And I spoke about this expansion of whiteness in my first workshop, you might recall, how different groups became white. And this is how a lot of them became white, through anti-Black and brown racism. So just to give you an idea, here are some cartoons, and there's lots of them. This is anti-Irish cartoons that precede the anti-Chinese one. And you can see the way Irish are depicted. Lots of children laying about, dependent on welfare, poor, angry, making trouble. And you can see from the face, they were depicted as Black people in whiteface, as they're same. As you can see in this cartoon, they're being depicted as Blacks and Irish were seen as the same at the bottom of the pile of the racial hierarchy. In fact, during the eugenics movement, their scientists worked hard to prove that the Irish race was an inferior race, that was the Irish race was just a slight variation of the Black race. And you can see that on the top left picture. You can see that the Western, the Anglo-Saxon face and physiology is being contrasted to the Negro and the Irish and Spanish. And you can see that it's very similar to the African race. And here on the bottom right, it's almost simian, almost like an ape, right? The Irish face, the Irish woman. Whoops. So, okay, so we're gonna take a 2-minute break again. Onar, could you stop the recording? Minutes is over. Okay. So the next section is Asian racialization is based on skin color, xenophobia, and class. So in that previous section, we learned the roots of Asian racialization, but we're going to see that this racialization, these stereotypes are not applied at least the same to all Asian groups. As we saw in the overview of Asian demographics, there's a lot of variation within the Asian community. So it's not surprising that there's also variations in how these stereotypes and racism are applied to different Asian groups. Okay, so in general, not just with Asians, but from any country and any point in history, coming from any country and going to any country, immigrants, meaning people who leave a country, tend to be polarized into the least educated and the most educated of their country of origin. I mentioned this last time as well. And that is because those who with middle levels of skill and education actually benefit the most by moving to within their country to the capital city. But the most educated often tend to have skills that are for which there are not a ton of opportunities in their country. So especially if they're college educated or have specialized skills, have grad degrees, they can benefit more living in Europe or the United States, and also if they're the least educated, even if they don't have a high school degree, they can make more money, doing wage labor, what's called mano de obra, unskilled work in Europe, United States than in their country. So, for example, immigrants to the United States, recent immigrants, arrivals, remember this is within 3 years, are less likely than the US to have finished high school. They're more likely to be high school dropouts, to have less than a high school degree, but also immigrants are also more likely to have a college and advanced degree. So you can see, the two extremes. So immigrants tend to be among the most educated and the least educated. Okay. And so it's similar with Asians as well. So here we have the share of Asians with a college degree. This is 2019 data. And so we can see that there's a lot of Asians, and you can see East Asians groups are disproportionately among these that have higher shares of college degree than white Americans. But we also see at the other end, you can see a big difference, right? Let's say so Vietnamese are sort of in between, but you can really see a big difference between very highly educated Asians on one end and very low educated, less educated Asians on the other end. You see that polarization, right? Again, this is reflective, all groups are like this. And you can see that Southeast Asians are more likely to be, but again, this is partly because of US immigration policies. So to get a visa, you generally need to have high education levels, high skill levels, or be a family member of somebody who's already over here. And so that is going to greatly advantage those with a college degree. On the other hand, those who are coming in with a low level of education are often political refugees, right? Or they can be undocumented workers. But since Asia is very far away from the United States, we don't have that many undocumented Asians, just is simply because of the geographic proximity. So, and then we can see actually similar, while I'm at it, I'm going to show you Latinx. We have that similar polarization. And here we can almost break them up. We can almost break up Latinx groups into three. So on one hand, you have the South Americans, for example, Venezuelans and Argentinians, who have a higher level of college share with a college degree than whites. And then you have in the middle, the Panamanians, Colombians, and Peruvians. And then over here, you have the lower educated. And Cubans, I'm not sure, they're sort of in between. I'm not sure which group they lie into, but you definitely have a group here on the right. On the right, we have the lower college educated, the lower educated groups tend to be from the Spanish Caribbean, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, or Mexicans, or Central Americans. And this is because they're less likely to have, they're less likely to get refugee status, and there's a disproportionate number who are undocumented or who are family members. Cubans, of course, are mostly here for refugee status. And then over here, the South Americans are the ones that are coming with the high skilled visas. So we can sort of come up with a racial hierarchy, right? Because the thing is that, especially in Latin America, but also in Asia, within Asian and almost every country, people who are more highly educated tend to be disproportionately lighter skinned, right? You can see this again in just about every country. Because of colorism in countries, the people who are higher educated, who have higher income, are disproportionately lighter, and people who are less educated and are relatively poor tend to be darker skinned. So you have the immigrants coming to the United States also tend to be among the lightest skins and the darkest skinned. And for Asian immigrants, so we're seeing the higher educated and skilled. These are skill-based and family-based immigration. And again, the lower educated and less skilled tend to be political refugee immigrants. Again, this is, I'm generalizing here. There's exceptions, of course, right? But this is the main thing. And then among the Latinx immigrants, again, the highest educated in skills are those coming in through skill-based and family-based immigration. And there's the exception of the Cubans, but generally the groups that are coming in who are lower educated, there's a higher proportion of undocumented economic immigration. Again, I'm really generalizing here. I'm sort of showing the extremes. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because to show how these different groups, again, these are I'm showing you sort of the extremes, but to show you how the different ways that they're racialized in the United States, okay? Those who are darker skinned are going to experience racism, and they're going to have the Black, anti-Black racist scripts or templates or narratives imposed on them, right? Whereas those who are lighter skinned and are more educated and richer, they're not going to experience quite a racism. They're going to experience something like ethnicism. So it's still stereotypes. It's still a type of xenophobia. It's still you're permanently foreign, but it's a little bit different, okay? And those in between, those darker skinned immigrants who are also who are less educated and have lower incomes, they're often going to experience something that's in between. It's both. It's racism / ethnicism, which may be called xenophobia. So for example, Blacks and Native Americans experience racism, right? And then here on lighter skinned, more educated, more assimilated Asians and Latinx, for example, South Americans, East Asians, South Asians, they're more likely to experience something along the lines of ethnicism. And here in the middle, those who are darker skinned, less educated, less assimilated, Latinx and Asians, we're talking about people, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Mexicans, Central Americans, and Southeast Asians, they're often going to experience something that's in between, that's part racist and part ethnicism. So, for example, Blacks and Indians are seen as racially inferior and criminal. Those are the racial scripts or template, right? Those who are experiencing ethnicism, they're going to experience something called honorary whites. So they're model minorities on one hand, but yet they're still forever foreign, is the expression. So whereas those in the middle, let's call them browns, they're going to get a mix. They're going to be considered, they're more likely to be seen as racially inferior, as criminal, illegal, and foreign, so alien citizens. Again, obviously I'm generalizing, it's a conceptual model, and it's important to note that not everybody in the group is going to be that. Individuals, this is very porous and dynamic and constantly shifting. So there's certain individuals don't have to fit this. This can move back and forth, and also this changes over time. As for example, we're going to see that in many ways, even more higher income, highly educated, lighter skinned East Asians went from in the late 1800s, they were considered they were experiencing the racism, right? The racism ethnicism, as we saw. We're going to see that in the 1950s and 1960s, they shift to being seen as honorary whites. And you saw that in 2020, 2021, boom, they went right back into the racism, ethnicism, right? It was suddenly yellow peril again. It was like yellow peril, model minority, and then back again, right? So it's constantly shifting, but I think this framework can help us sort of see that, help differentiate the distinction between racism, ethnicism, and that blurring in between, and that shifting back and forth. And in fact, that helps us see how different groups get fit into the United States racial hierarchy. Okay, so let's say this is the United States racial hierarchy. So on the bottom, we have Black people, darker, and including Afro-Latinos, darker skinned, non-educated Blacks, clearly on the bottom, right? A little bit above that, we have maybe the brown alien citizens. So these are darker skinned, non-educated, non-whites, non-Blacks. So actually Afro-Latinos may be in either of those places, depending on their skin color and also the educational level. So this group would include of Latinx, this would include, not all, of course, but many Mexicans, especially darker skinned, lower income, Mexicans, Central Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans. And within Asians, it may include some darker skinned and poor, low income, and less educated Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. Then we might have, let's divide up the honorary whites into two groups. So you might have, let's think of a transition or buffer group. For example, the Cubans, educated Blacks, and high income Blacks, and Filipinos and Vietnamese, somewhere in between. And then above that, we have the honorary whites, model minority, yet still foreign or forever foreign. So lighter skinned, educated non-whites, and that might include very elite Blacks, right, who have made it, so the stars, the South Americans, Indians, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, and multiracial people, intermarried people. Again, I'm just really generalizing, right? Remember that. And there's individuals. Remember, this is constantly shifting and changing, and that it's porous, okay? And at the very top, we would have educated whites, elite whites. But you notice I've skipped a rung on the racial hierarchy. I know this is kind of controversial, but maybe it's non-educated whites who are in that category. Maybe they are no longer really white in some ways, maybe in some ways, educated, elite, multiracial people and East Asians and South Americans are in many ways have a higher position in our social hierarchy, especially from the point of view of educated whites. And maybe that's why they're so angry, and that's why they're lashing back, because they feel themselves being displaced, right? They see these non-white groups who are making it better than them and doing better than them and being seen socially and economically as better than them. And that's why they're fighting so hard, because they're always used to being above all non-whites, of course. I don't know. This is just that's just a guess of mine. This is not a written in stone fact or anything. I can't wait to hear what you guys think about it. So that was that, and the next thing I'm going to say before we have our break is that these marginal groups often attain honorary whiteness by engaging in or being used by anti-Black, brown racism. That's our next section. So you recall that the Irish became white by using the anti-Chinese movement and anti-Black racism to prove their whiteness, right? So we see a little bit of that with the honorary whites, with the Asian honorary whites. However, I want to be very, very clear that's a little bit different in that it's not Asians themselves that were engaging in anti-Black racism and anti-Mexican racism, but rather that they were being used by conservative whites to do the same thing. Okay, so Asians became honorary whites in part because conservatives used them to delegitimize claims of systemic racism against Blacks and delegitimize claims of systemic xenophobia against Mexicans. This is from Erica Lee, The Making of Asian America. By late 20th century, xenophobia did not treat all new immigrants the same. You see that differentiation of that racialization, right? Nowhere was the binary division of good and bad immigrant more apparent than in how immigrants from Asia were treated and discussed versus immigrants from Latin America. Although some of the media discourse referred to the high levels of immigration from both places in generally negative ways, it was the threat from Latin America and specifically Mexico that became the near exclusive focus of xenophobes. Asian immigrants, once so despised that they had been largely excluded from the United States, were slowly being remade into supposed model minorities, racial minorities who had worked hard to overcome obstacles and achieve the American dream, even as it masked persistent racial discrimination of that all Asians face, and also inequality that within the Asian American community. The intent was to delegitimize claims of systemic racism and discrimination in the United States as a cause for educational and income gaps between whites and non-whites, and promote the idea of a colorblind society in which opportunity was equal to all. If Asian Americans could succeed, proponents of the minority discourse argued, why couldn't others? Then I'm going to focus in on affirmative action. So again, I want to really emphasize that it's not Asian Americans themselves mostly who are doing this, but rather that being used by conservative whites. So as we can see here, most Asians support affirmative action. Okay, so I just want to make that clear. But Asians are often used as racial mascots by anti-affirmative action conservatives. This is from Nancy Chung Alred. It's a journal article. Asian Americans may stand to benefit in distinct and discrete ways from the dismantling of race-conscious programs in higher education, but less drastically than some may suggest. Indeed, Asian Americans have become used as mascots by the opponents of affirmative action. This mascoting is a negative force that, rather than creating any viable advantages for Asian Americans, reinforces the pervasive white privilege that affirmative action programs are designed to combat. While the manufactured political debate using Asian Americans as mascots reinforces the model minority myth, white privilege remains invisible. Meanwhile, Asian Americans are isolated and pitted against other minority groups. This balkanization serves to reintroduce a modern form of the yellow peril that has plagued Asians since their first arrival in the Americas. The term racial mascoting was first proposed by Professor Sumi Cho at a conference in 1994 and was soon adopted by scholars in the field. It means the adoption of a racial group by a white political figure or constituency. A practice I refer to as mascoting is necessary to deflect charges of racism and preserve the redeemed status of whiteness. In the same journal article, she shows that eliminating affirmative action primarily benefits whites, not Asians. She writes, 3 years after the implementation of Prop 209 and SB 1, William Kidder conducted an empirical study of Asian American law school applicants to 3 of the UC law schools, Berkeley, Davis, and UCLA. What he found was that enrollments increased substantially for whites, were essentially unchanged for APAs, and plummeted for African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. Thus, it was white applicants to the law schools rather than Asian American applicants who were the main beneficiaries of the ban on race-conscious affirmative action in the UC system. And here, this is some data that I crunched to show that Asian college admissions are impacted more by white preferential admissions than by Black affirmative action. So this data is from the economic study that's listed on the bottom. And this data was Exhibit A, or this journal article was Exhibit A in the federal court case Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which is the most recent affirmative action case where Asians were used as racial mascoting. So the claim was that Asian American college admissions was being decreased by affirmative action by Blacks, right? So, and because of this court case, then Harvard University was forced by the courts to hand over all of their admissions data for 5 years. Like, usually this is not available to the public normally. So I created this graph on myself, but on the left, this is all the students who were admitted to Harvard over the period 2014 and 19. On the first column is whites that were admitted under preferential admissions. And these made up 43% of white admitted students during this period. And by preferential admissions, I'm talking about the athletic scholarships. And no, we're not talking about basketball and football scholarships to Black and brown students, or at least not primarily. We're talking about mostly most of these athletes, for example, fencing and squash. They're mostly going to high income whites. In fact, Harvard University had an internal survey and found that over 50% of athletes at Harvard came from families that made $500,000 or more. So of athletes that applied during this period, 86% were admitted. Of legacy students who applied, meaning their parents went to Harvard, 34% were admitted. Of Dean's Interest List students who applied, that's mostly donors, 42% were admitted. Of children of faculty, 47% were admitted. Of these preferential admissions, 74% were white and many were wealthy, versus African Americans, 7.5% were admitted. Turning back to the graph, the second column is a subset of the first column. So of these whites who were admitted under preferential admissions, the second column is those who were unqualified based on the Harvard admissions officer's internal standards. So they had a system, very complicated system, came up to another points, but what they would do is everybody at one point in the stage, once they'd calculated the points, everybody underneath below a certain floor got thrown out as unqualified. So this second column is students, white students were admitted under preferential admissions who do not meet Harvard admissions officer's own minimum standards. And these were 16% of total admits. At the far right, the economists were unable to identify which, if any, Black students had benefited from affirmative action. And that is because affirmative action is largely unconstitutional. The interesting thing is all of this, these preferential admissions that wealthy whites mostly benefit from, is completely legal, very explicit, plus points, very, very explicitly legal, and it's documented in their internal data. But affirmative action based on race is largely unconstitutional. At this point, it can only be used as a factor of a factor of a factor. The examples that were given is you can take into consideration, on top of everything else, that they were the president of the Black Student Union, or if they wrote an essay that talked about the importance of the Korean church to them. You're allowed to take that into consideration among many other factors. But because essentially affirmative action based on race is illegal, the economists were unable to identify who, if any, of the Blacks had benefited, and so they were forced to list every single Black person who was admitted. Of course, these are not percentages, right? And you would have to calculate the percentage. But overall, you can see in absolute numbers, Asian Americans who are not getting in, it's much more likely that they're not getting in because of whites, wealthy whites who are admitted under preferential admissions. In fact, even unqualified whites who are admitted under preferential admissions than by Black affirmative action.
Okay, and I think, let's see, I think I thought I had a break in here. But let's just go ahead and take a last, oh wait, no, we're gonna take the break after this. I forgot because number 6 is long.
Okay.
This is very short. This is only 2 slides. So the status of honorary whites is deceptive. We really already talked about this for 2 reasons. And one is because, like we said, we mentioned before, this group identity of Asians as honorary whites and Hmong minorities masks significant inequalities among Asians, right? We saw that, the vast inequality, and here we can see huge differences in poverty levels, and we can see that there's some Asian groups who are really struggling and not doing as well. And I've already spoken about this. And the other reason why this status of honorary whites and minority is deceptive, because even successful Asians continue to experience racial discrimination. So this is a study, a 2016 study found that Asian job candidates are much less likely to get called for an interview if a hiring manager can tell that the applicant is Asian, even with the exact same credentials. So the researchers sent out matched resumes. They sent out the original resume, this was for both African Americans and Asian. They would send out the original version of the resume plus a whitened version. So the whitened version stripped the resume of anything, any indicator or hint that the person was either African American or Asian. For example, if their first name sounded quote unquote Asian or Black, they would change it to the middle name or to an initial. Or if they were president of the Korean Student Association, then it would get changed to president of Student Association. And they found that Asians who whitened their job resumes get more interviews. 21% of whitened Asian resumes received callbacks versus 11.5% of the non-whitened versions. There was something similar for African Americans. Okay, now we'll take a break.
Okay.
Number 7 is just one slide. Section 7 is just one slide. 6 is a little longer though. The status of Asians as honorary whites is precarious or fragile. So in America for Americans, Professor Erica Lee writes, the weaponization of xenophobia during the global COVID-19 pandemic highlighted how xenophobia, like systemic racism, was one of America's enduring pre-existing conditions that has always made economic, public health, and international crises even worse for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islander communities. And she was partly talking about in how there were higher rates of COVID in certain communities, but also because she's referring to, of course, the anti-Asian violence. No matter their long, and this is in a different book of hers, the other book, but no matter their long histories and deep roots in this country, Asian Americans are still viewed as racial outsiders and foreigners, especially during times of crisis. So this is not a phrase attributed to anybody in particular, but many people have noted that we see a cycle from yellow peril to honorary white minority and back again. Okay. And in fact, so crises like the pandemic expose societal fault lines that have been superficially masked or papered over. And we really see that with respect to xenophobia in the Asian community. Specifically, there's 3 big examples of this. One is when we had the crisis of World War II, then we see
Japanese internment. During the crisis of the decline of the US car industry and jobs, we see the murder of Chinese American Vincent Chin. And during the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see the surge in anti-Asian violence. We see, remember the two intersecting the Venn diagram between racism and xenophobia. We see Asians moving up into to honorable whites, but then in times of crisis, boom, it goes right back to experiencing the hardcore, more racialized xenophobia. So one was the crisis during World War II. We were fighting again, obviously against Japan, Italy, and German. But we decided that every single Japanese American, both Japanese immigrants, first generation, as well as second, third generation. In fact, even if you had one drop of Japanese blood, you were considered a threat to the country. That you were more loyal to Japan than you were to America, and so they needed to be locked up, interned, and there was 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned in 10 detainment camps. 2/3 were U.S. citizens. But this did not happen to German American citizens or to Italian American citizens. Some were interned, but only a small fraction of them were interned, only the ones that were deemed to be disloyal or dangerous, of risk. But with Japanese American, there was no due process, there was no checking, it was just automatic by the fact that you were Japanese American, even have a drop of Japanese American. That was supposedly enough proof that you could, join the Japanese ranks and fight in the war against the United States. And you can see the parallels to what we did, how we repatriated Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans during the Great Depression, which of course was also another example of a national crisis, right? You saw how quickly during a national crisis, Mexican Americans suddenly became foreign, right? Taking away American jobs. It's similar here during this crisis. Suddenly Japanese American become foreign, right? So here is the on the left, we see the executive order. They often had 1 week to close up their affairs, 1 week to sell their businesses, their lands, their homes, pack up, and of course they've lost. They lost all that. Imagine trying to fire sale, right? Imagine having to sell everything within a week, and of course everybody knows that you have no recourse, so they basically practically had to give it away. And this is the reason why. So they were considered Japanese Americans were considered to be foreign citizens that are invading, right? This is a cartoon by Dr. Seuss, the who wrote the Dr. Seuss books, the children's books, waiting for the signal from home as in Japan, all right? And so these are supposed very racist. These are Japanese Americans who are waiting for who are stocking up on TNT, on dynamite, and on the West Coast, and waiting for the signal from Japan. And you see here it says honorable fifth column. So fifth column means a group within a country at war who are sympathetic to or working for its enemies, right? And so that's why and so you notice, what does that sound like? It comes back to the old Chinese immigrant stereotypes of an unarmed foreign invasion that would overrun the United States and displace whites. That old stereotypes from the late 1880s is still with us was still with us. As you can see, we're going to see it carries out through over history, keeps coming back, especially in times of crisis, those same stereotypes. So we removed Japanese immigrants and like I said, even second and third generation from the entire California area, which was where they were concentrated. The idea was to remove them from the coast, where I guess they would have contact with Japan or something. So we removed them internally and put them into the concentration camps that are marked. And these are some photos. They're reminiscent not just of the removal of Mexicans and Mexican Americans during the Great Depression, but you can also see it looks similar to rounding up of Jews in Germany and Europe, right? Taking them to the concentration camps. Instead of a yellow star, you can see they have labels, identification tags on them, but rounding them up into trains, definitely reminiscent, right? And this is what the camps looked like. They were all, as you can see, very remote areas, very rough. This is what they looked like inside. An entire family would have to stay in a very small area. These are school children on the bottom right. And then even once the war was over and they were allowed to go home, this is the conditions they faced. They faced virulent anti-Japanese attitudes that had been whipped up and weaponized. Remember we talked about that in our first workshop, how racist biases get whipped up and weaponized by policies and practices. And this is an excellent example. So they got intensified. And so they faced horrible racism when they got back home. And of course, they had lost all their money. They had lost their houses, their homes, their businesses, everything was completely lost. An excellent book, by the way, is a graphic novel by George Takei. They called this Enemy, and he was a little boy as a little boy, he was in these internment camps. So he writes about his experiences. It's a beautiful graphic novel. After a lot of advocacy and organizing by Japanese Americans, the federal government finally gave an official apology and $20,000 each to each of the remaining victims in 1988. Of course, 20,000 is just a drop in a bucket compared to everything they lost. And by the way, it took even longer for the California governments and different cities and states and also universities. Speaking of the UC system, the Japanese students who were in school at the time, they got kicked out. So it took a while. This is even out 1988. Took even longer for individual institutions and individual cities to apologize. Okay. The second crisis I want to talk about is the decline of U.S. car industry and jobs in 1982. In part, it was due to larger forces of deindustrialization, but in part, it was due to competition from the Japanese market. The Japanese market was producing autos, of course, better cars and more efficiently. So there was a drop in, there was a crisis, drop in unemployment in the Detroit auto making factories. So 2 white auto workers who were out of work brutally murdered a Chinese American young man named Vincent Chin. He was actually out celebrating it was his bachelor party. He was celebrating, when they go out to celebrate before they get married. It was horrible. There was a confrontation within the, I think they were watching girls, as they do in bachelor parties. There's a confrontation between the 2 white auto workers was a father and son. They took him to be Japanese. He's Chinese American, but they took him to be Japanese. And they took out their anger on the competition from the Japanese auto industry on this Chinese American. So you can see the layers in that. So first of all, this American person is being seen as the representative of a foreign industry. And also you can see the conflation. All Asians are the same, right? So even though he was Chinese, you represent a Japanese auto industry, right? And these are 2 big problems that you have that we experience often over and over again. All Asians are the same. They're all Chinese, and any Asian American, no matter how many generations is here, is somehow still foreign and representative of an Asian country. It led to, it was horrible. They took, one of them held him down while the other one beat his head in with a baseball bat. It was brutal. It was nasty. And this happened in 1982. This spurred possibly the first major, first political advocacy and movement of Asian Americans. And this is when, so there was a mobilization behind it, a rallying cry. It galvanized the birth of the Asian American movement. This is where we see the birth of Asian American organizations, and also for the first time, really, we see the birth of the term Asian American. But again, you see it harks back to the old stereotypes, right? The idea that Asians are undercutting white workers' wages, taking American jobs, and undermining the economy, right? Each time we have a crisis, we go back to those same old stereotypes. And the third, of course, I'm skipping, there's something, there, I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my technology there. The third national crisis, of course, is the surge in anti-Asian hate crimes after the COVID-19 crisis in 2020-21. And we see the same thing. We see suddenly there's a surge in hate crimes. And by the way, they were very much gender-based. The majority of crimes were committed against women, Asian women. And also I want to, I'm not going to go into detail about conflicts and cooperation between different minority groups until next time, but I just want to acknowledge that a substantial percentage of the hate crimes was committed by Blacks. We'll go more into that next time. But the point I want to make right now is how quickly we went back to those same stereotypes, right? So the idea was that the Chinese bring diseases, right? And so again, they would hark back to that old Chinese stereotype of spreaders of dangerous infectious diseases, right? And also the idea of these diseases coming from eating rats or bats, right? They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we're seeing some very strong rhyming here. So this is why people say from yellow peril to honorary white or model minority and back again, right? How quickly it shifts back. And again, just like after Vincent Chin, there was a lot of organizing after it. And also just like after Vincent Chin, there was there was increase in identification among Asian Americans as Asian American. So let's say before Vincent Chin and before the pandemic, a lot of Asian Americans would have identified as Chinese American or Vietnamese American or Korean American. But the effect of that racism from the outside has the effect of increasing that a feeling of commonality, a feeling of affinity, of something common. And so we see a rise in increase in identification as Asian American, as opposed to, or in addition to a more specific definition. And we can, this is pretty recent, this survey, so approximately 20 to 25% of people in the AAPI community are report identifying as with the broader AAPI community, less so among Indians, but, and less so among conservatives. And conclusion is just one slide. Xenophobia, we can see from these patterns that xenophobia has to be addressed systemically from the roots. So this is from Erica Lee, The Making of Asian American. According to B. Wynn, the long history of Asian American violence in the United States was erased and not told very intentionally to make us keep our heads down, to pit communities of color against each other, to make us adhere to this model minority myth. Education was the answer, many explained, because addressing the problem of anti-Asian hate was not possible without understanding its roots. And I would add the patterns too, right? While Asian activists acknowledged that racism targeted Asian Americans and Black Americans differently, they also recognized that police violence, immigrant surveillance, mass incarceration, and economic and health inequities were part of the same interlocking systems of oppression that impacted both communities. And I would also add Latinx and Mexicans. Organizers in the Twin Cities added, though our stories may be different, our fight and struggle are shared. We've always been stronger when we've worked together. The goal, these and other advocates argued, was not just to win a victory for one community or one campaign. It was to change the entire system. So we have completed what we learned today. Is we went on an overview of Asian demographics. We went over the roots of Asian racialization back in the late 19th century, specifically the Chinese. We learned that the Asian racialization is differentiated based on skin color, xenophobia, and class, and constantly changing dynamic. But those are the factors that go into it. That marginal groups are often attain honorary whiteness by engaging in, or in the case of Asians, being used by anti-Black or brown racism. The status of honorary whites is deceptive because, first of all, there's huge differences within the Asian community, and also even when Asians are very successful, they still continue to experience racism. And the status of Asians as honorary whites is precarious. Every time there's a national crisis, we see people going right back to those old stereotypes. And the conclusion is xenophobia must be addressed systemically as a system. We have finished. And let's see. I would like, we're going to take a 2-minute brain break, but also I'm going to just give you a heads up that after we finish the 2-minute brain break, I'm going to ask everyone to share in the chat your thoughts, some possible prompts, or what new, different, or deeper understanding did you gain from this, actually the entire seminar? What connections did you make to prior knowledge or your experiences? And what questions do you have? But don't start writing yet. We're going to take a 2-minute break, okay?
Thanks, Ayo. I'll stop the recording now.
Love for everybody to share in the chat. Okay, I'm going to start reading the comments. I won't say any names. Just let's see, go back to, okay. And then the government turned around and recruited Japanese American youth to fight in World War II in special units that had a very high death rate. It's exactly. In one way, it was posed as a way to prove themselves. And also it was one of the only ways they could get out of the camps. And some of them felt a need because they had been so dishonored, and they felt an internal need to prove the loyalty of their community. So yes, they volunteered in very high numbers. They were in a segregated units, and exactly had a very high death rate. USC gave honorary degrees, I'm guessing, to the Japanese students who had been kicked out just this year. I think that is pretty sad. I did not know the federal government paid financial reparations to interned Japanese. Have other groups in America received payments like that? The distinction they make is that they only made the payments to those who are still surviving. And with other, for example, with African American reparations, the argument is that the direct enslaved people are no longer alive. Of course, there's many arguments against that, but I'm just explaining why, how they distinguish the two. And this is a quote from Mohammed Safa: "No immigrant has taken your job. You were laid off by a capitalist who required cheap labor and took advantage of that immigrant to increase his profits. And nothing makes him happier than to hear you blame the immigrant and not him." It's definitely along the lines of what we've seen. I recently watched an episode of Vincent Chin's life with Lisa Ling, where she talked about what happened to Vincent Chin while discussing anti-Asian hate crimes. Worth a watch if you haven't seen it. I really like the way it was summarized how honorary whiteness is deceptive and used for anti-Black and brown racism, but that it is also precarious in a pervasive and systemic way. I really enjoyed the presentation, really informative, and shows how we have a lot of work to do moving forward in our society. It's frightening how history keeps repeating itself and how certain folks can't escape the confines of this hate. The whitening of the Irish was an eye-opener. Also, the honorary started, I think, with the Nazis calling the Japanese honorary Aryans. I wasn't aware of that. That's possible. I think the term has to do with, it's not real. It's just a fake label. But of course, there's nothing behind it. But I don't know the origin. So that's, I'll look that up. Although I'm aware of it, it's still jarring to see history so clearly repeating itself. The rhetoric around Asian folks and disease in the 1800s to what we see now, centuries later. I myself am a Cambodian Chinese American, first generation student who has received a master's degree and have experienced firsthand the privilege that other Asians have received for academic resources and opportunities. Southeast Asians definitely are a huge minority group, often seen as less than in the Asian community. And it's still shocking to see it in quantitative data, but thank you for speaking on this topic. Agree with blank. This history is an important lens for many things happening now. The flip-flop of attitude depending on how much a race is needed at the time is something I hadn't understood prior to these sessions. In a matter of 10 years, how the attitude can change. It really is overwhelming. Please read, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Hanani K. Trusk, From a Native Daughter, to gain insights on women of color feminisms about empire and colonialism. This was a very helpful discussion about how we reproduce and perpetuate racism every day. The power of narrative. Words can be more dangerous than the words that kill BIPOC bodies. The images of class and educational attainment among different Asian groups and its comparison to Blacks, whites, and Latinos was very powerful. Growing up in the 1960s, I have many memories of the pain and harmful rhetoric against all non-white Americans. Our parents beat us into acting white so that we would have easier lives. This session gave me a pain in the pit of my stomach, which comes and goes, but burned, particularly from not having to look at all the ugliness today.
I would really love to incorporate the reading club idea as a partner to this series. As somebody mentioned earlier, that you should do that you could form a reading club based on the books I've recommended during this series. I found it interesting that current political and social movements affect the people's views towards race over time. Yellow Peril, model citizens, back again. It's almost as if we go with the flow of shifting blame to an enemy instead of having a firm and continuous belief and practice that we are all human and equals.
Mm-hmm.
Expansion of whiteness as an honorary status with a false bottom. It changes with the tide of socio-political economic influences. I didn't realize it is so erratic. Is this capitalism at work? My mother's friend, Haura, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, I apologize, was in a Japanese internment camp when she was a little girl. She talks very little about it, but I know it was very difficult for her and her family. They lost everything. It makes me sick to see the cartoons and think about what they must have gone through. I found this seminar to be very interesting and shocking at places. It definitely got me thinking deeper about all the inequities that exist over time to various groups. This further reinforced some of the notions of honorary whiteness I had been exploring over the last few months, particularly, and like Danielle mentions in the chat, how precarious honorary whiteness is, because the second there is any kind of turbulence, honorary whites are stripped of their whiteness and very quickly attacked and vilified. Irish coming into whiteness by utilizing anti-Asian and Black rhetoric. I had an opportunity to meet with a woman many years ago who was in a Japanese internment camp here in the Central Valley. She and her family lost everything. What Ayo said earlier about the white without education resenting the darker skinned but higher earners, that makes so much sense. Scary, but I think true, especially now with our vice president of Asian ancestry. I found the racial hierarchy color graphic very interesting. We often think of poor whites as having more in common with other ethnic groups in terms of education and income, but the graphic, your comments about displacement and anger really drove it home for me. I would like to know more about this. And by the way, that is not, that's just my idea. It's something that I'm throwing out there. It's something that I'm wondering, the placement. The rest of it, there's lots of documentation, a lot of tons of other experts and scholars who are saying the same thing. But that placement of poor whites, that was just, I just put it there. It's a question I have, I wonder. But to me, it seems to explain a lot. It made sense to me, but I just want to let you know that was just me. Seeing the images of class across the Asian population and how the comparison to other minorities was an eye-opener. I think the visualization of how whiteness is ingrained into white society for the purpose of assimilation. As a first generation born, I can relate to your presentation, and it is always mind-blowing to listen to the experiences that other groups experience. I guess it's the same. I think it's great, and worth further thought, I'm guessing, about the placement of poor whites. Okay, so I'm gonna open up, and those of us who are here, I'd appreciate it if you could turn on your cameras if you're able to. Just helps when we're talking, and like to open up the conversation verbal. Anybody would like to speak up?
Hi, yeah, I wanted to follow up on what I said about the Aryans. Yeah, Aryan, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it very well. So I looked it up, the honorary white. It looks like the first time it was actually used was in South Africa during apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is, just my point was that this has happened a lot in America, but unfortunately, we're not the only ones that do it, and it is almost like, there were precedents that made it easier for this to become mainstream.
Thank you for that information.
Yeah, I think for me, right, that this whole colorism and model minority, right, really is also at the pit of my stomach, along with everything else that you've shared, and how that paler skin is admired, and even within my family, right? Like I'm the darkest one, right? And so the messages I get of like, why do you want to get dark? Why do you want to get dark? Just really, it's just so, again, someone said jarring, right? Now understanding the context of why you don't want to get dark, and further research, right? The Philippines, I don't know, but I forgot the date, but they passed it was called an ugly law. So if you're darker than a brown paper bag, they can actually discriminate on jobs, on anything. So yeah, it's called the ugly law. And I was just like, wow, that is just, the whole colonialism and the impact of America in the Philippines.
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't emphasize a lot. With the Latinx, seminar, I really went back into the racism and colorism that preceded, during the colonialism before and in the country before they came here. I didn't go into it a lot, but I only mentioned it in passing, that because of colorism in each of countries, and I'm sure you've seen it in the Philippines, it's not, of course, exact, but there's a disproportionate darker skinned people in the bottom and disproportionate higher skin. Same thing in India and South Asia. In most Asian countries, it's the same. So, and that's because of colorism over there, right? Even before you come over here. I remember I had a Filipino colleague, and every time it was sunny outside, she would wear a parasol, an umbrella outside, so as to not get any darker. So there's very strong colorism. Of course, it's, again, just like with Latinx countries, it's a mix of the colorism and racism during the Spanish colonial era, and of course also during the United States occupation, right? Because remember, the United States colonized the Philippines, and you remember the really racist cartoons. So of course, all of that has an effect even before Filipinos come here. But that is why, along with that polarization of income and education among immigrants, there tends to be also a polarization of skin color.
It's interesting too that I guess in the 1920s or thereabouts, that white Europeans started getting tans, and that was okay if they got darker, right? It didn't change anything as far as their status. I imagine folks find that kind of ridiculous.
I've also heard some anecdotal stories about folks with whiter skin or lighter skin not wanting to be darker because it was an indicator that you were like an outdoor laborer and you worked in the fields or you worked outside. And so if you retained, as a white person, a very pale white skin without any kind of skin color or tan, it implied your social hierarchy of being someone who was always inside and working indoors, or maybe not even working. You just have the resources not to work at all, and you just sit inside and sip tea from a cup, that kind of thing.
Yes, definitely. I forgot to mention that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Probably the popularization of redneck, also taking pride in the fact that they work outside. And then there's a story that I interviewed a professor when I was in grad school, and she was Cherokee, and she talked to me about I interviewed her about her history and her family. And she talked about her grandma when they would get ready to go out on the weekends, how they would, the girls would go and use this white powder to put on their faces so that they could look as white as possible before they went out, because they could pass because they were light enough, but this also helped them to get into different places. And then I remember the story when I talked to my grandma about it because of her Native heritage, and she was 50%, maybe 60, 70% maybe. But she always, and I never knew this until she was much older, but she was ashamed of her cheekbones because they were so high. She was afraid people would be able to identify her as Native American at the time because it was such a shame for her when she was growing up.
I'll read. There's another new comment. Yes, there was a viral tweet recently about a scholar applying to a grant for underrepresented researchers, but was denied because they told her being Asian did not qualify as underrepresented in education. Right. She posted a few public tweets describing how this impacted her as among American women and how breaking down the category of Asian is important because it often overlooks hidden disparities within the AAPI community.
I wanted to bring that up as well, just because in my current role, we do have funding for our students. And one of the requirements for our program is targeted for underrepresented minorities, but that doesn't include Asian. And when I mentioned, I'm also Cambodian. And so we are grouped into the Asian category, right? But we don't qualify for this funding because we're Asian. So yeah, that would be students that I would have to turn away, even though they do need the opportunity.
Right.
Wow, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I also just briefly saw something earlier today about how Blacks and Asians, and frankly, I don't remember, Io, if you mentioned something like this or not in something you said. It might have been in a statistic, or maybe I saw it somewhere else, about the improving the percentages for getting an interview for a job by just changing, of course, your first name, or you know, if it was identifiable as far as another group.
Yeah, I showed the data on that to study that, but whitening the resume.
Yes.
I agree on that as well. My parents were immigrants, and when they came to America, they decided to give me a white name so that I can have these opportunities, right? My brother didn't have a white name, and we see that as well. But for myself and my younger sister, we both have white names.
Emily, can I ask you a question? So how do they define underrepresented?
They have a list of categories based on like their funding opportunities. So we have to go based on that, unfortunately. Yeah, so they have Hispanics, Latinos, Blacks and African American. They have Native American, and they have to, and a Pacific Islander, but specifically from Native Pacific Islanders. So if you're categorized as Filipino American, you would not be eligible for this grant.
Wow.
And is that a federal or state grant?
It's a federal.
And don't they have guidelines that talk about the differences?
That's what I said. That is exactly why I was like, So
yeah, that seemed right.
Yeah, so I have to be very careful with this funding, because you know that's who they target. So it's interesting.
I have something that I kind of was thinking about, and I wrote a little bit about it, but it's very frightening to me how the history keeps repeating itself. When you have World War II and then the 80s and now the pandemic. So it's, you know, I'm fearful for my children and the things that are going to happen, you know, to them and what they're going to go through. You know, I mean, you see it in other aspects of of life as well, right? Housing market, elections, like things like that. They kind of, history kind of repeats itself because people aren't paying attention. And so that's where I was kind of hoping like we can figure out, we could, have more purpose in what we do to get rid of this systematic hate. I mean, because when it came around to the pandemic, it was anything that anybody could do to perpetuate hate onto the Asian folks. And it didn't make any sense to me because I was just like, I mean, it's a virus. Like, you can't, what are you going to do? Right. And so I wonder if there's anything that, we could do as a society, to kind of backtrack a bit so that we're not, repeating ourselves again in the future. And this is, we'll have to go through this one more time, and in the future after that, and in the future after that. Do you know what I mean?
I can just say something real quickly, and it kind of relates to that, in that I believe the governor's race for Virginia, I think it was Youngkin versus McAuliffe, and McAuliffe was the Democrat incumbent, and then and he lost last night. And they really think that it was primarily because he ran on education and the economy, of course, but education specifically with regard to, I will not let them teach critical race theory to your children in public schools. And we know that that is not taught in the public schools. It's that's something that we typically have in colleges. And so they got that, and they continued to push that, even though it wasn't true. But he continued to say that he was going to fight, for that, to make sure that no one, your children wouldn't be exposed to it. And he won based on a lie, but it was propagandized in such a way that people believed it. And so, given that, and the fact that, I would like to think we try not to make the same mistakes over and over again, but I think people seem to be in this weird or odd place where they want to believe, and they're not doing the research to figure out if it's true or not. And some of them do the research, but they're looking at sources that may not be reputable. So it's very confusing and strange time. And I don't know, I mean, with all the history work that you've done, do you think we learn from our mistakes, or do we have to have these patterns, and is it inch by inch, or will we ever be able to, make a stride in the right direction? I know it ebbs and flows, but at the same time, progress is slow.
Yeah, I believe so. The CRT is, I mean, even though it's obviously critical race theory is not taught in the classroom, it's being used as a code word to mean any discussion of underlying race in the classroom. So I'm a former U.S. history teacher, so I belong to several Facebook groups of U.S. history teachers, where we're trading strategies and lesson plans. But over the last year, and including today, like every other day, I see a post by a U.S. history teacher saying, "Help, I just taught the same lesson that I've taught for years now without a problem, just basic, nothing controversial, just basic U.S. history." And I got called into the principal's office because supposedly for the critical race theory, and my principal told me that I have to remove every mention of race or racism from my U.S. history lesson, the same lesson I've been teaching, that's just like straight out of they're like, I swear, it's just like a basic, I'm just teaching U.S. history. I'm not even a social justice person, but you have to, they want everything that mentions race or any kind of inequity. Also, a lot of women's history is being cut out. Anything, and including this history that I taught you, is also being cut out. And I'm mentioning this because this is a part of history. This is the backlash to the George Floyd uprising. So after the George Floyd uprising, there was this promise like, oh, we're going to be woke now. We're going to finally go, it's the third reconstruction. We're finally going to go back and fix things. And this is the backlash to it. And this I mean, everyone who studies history knew this was coming. It was, I have to admit, it was a little worse than I expected, but every single time there's a hope of racial progress, bam, there's a backlash. So this is to be expected, but these back also within within the Asian history, it's also, these are backlashes that we see. So we're seeing after Vincent Chin, after World War II, we can also consider those as a type of backlash. The only thing I can tell you that's hopeful is that, the expression, the arc of history, so even though there is a backlash, in the end, we are seeing slow progress. If you look at the big picture, you can recognize progress, but it's not like, we're not going straight up like this. We sort of go like this, in cycles where each time there's progress, there's a backlash. And then we go forward again, and then a backlash. But it is very slowly, a long, big picture that is slowly going upward. I'm not sure if that's assuring or reassuring or not, but.
It just seems like, in some of the parents, the complaint was about that teaching whatever's happening in history in public schools, is that no child in the class should feel bad about history. Well, I mean, how can we even teach history if we don't tell what happened? I mean, yeah, just a comment. Yeah. But thanks, Io, that helps, but it does sound a bit like a slinky going round and round there.
And yes, the same things are happening in English books that are anything that mentions race.
Yes, you're right. And oh gosh,
in one state, it was ridiculous. A picture book about Ruby, the little girl who was the first Black girl who was to integrate.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, Ruby.
Oh, no. I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, they even banned, it was a children's picture book about a girl who integrated, and they said because it presented whites in a bad way. Some whites, it wasn't even all whites, right? But some whites were presented. Of course, they had to show that there were people against the integration, and that's a no-go. But also, to take it back to this seminar, what we learned today is also not taught in U.S. history classroom, right? And just like anti-Black Black violence and also anti-Asian, all this history. Most people don't learn this history that I taught you today, or the history of the Latinx racialization, or of women in needs, or even of low income poor white people, or even of white allies. We don't get stories about white allies either. We need all of these stories. We need to know all of our history in order to work together to move forward.
I guess the one good thing is that in college, you're still getting this education, and that we're all getting the benefit of this right now, even if it seems like the world outside is turning things off. As long as we keep moving here, we'll be able to make an impact there, I think.
And I'm talking too much, but I'm going to give you a quick reminder again that you have access to this recording. And you can use it in your classroom, in your clubs, the entire UC Merced community. Use it. Take advantage of it.
How long will we have access? Will it be forever? Or will it
a year, I've said. So
okay.
We can negotiate later on, but let's say a year for now.
All right, thank you.
I've been speaking too much. Can somebody read the comments that just came in?
Yeah, comments says, I was shocked in 2020 when there was an executive order issued in late September to ban federal government as well its contractors, subcontractors, grantees from offering certain diversity training on racial and gender biases. Teachings that the order called divisive, citing political correctness and maligning ideology, including internal book clubs in search of anti-American propaganda and discussions about white privilege in attempting to halt certain types of race-related training. Yes, that is true. Yes.
They tried to stop internal book clubs.
Internal book clubs or anything, those who quote diversity training, right? So, most of us may know some folks who do those type of seminars, as IO does, right? And I do remember some of my colleagues were like, well, how can I make my curriculum not diversity training or fall in these categories, right? Because that was their main source of income, right? That just recently happened.
I also want to share on our comment from Malvo that I think is very interesting. She said, speaking of white allies in Livingston, which that's a town near Merced, I heard that some Japanese people were able to get their properties back thanks to their white friends from church. I would love to know more about that.
Yeah.
and how those of us who are allies can assist folks to make that happen. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have said that was, after the internment ended, they came back and they were able to get their properties back.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Do you know any more details that you could share with us?
No, it was just this was pre-pandemic. I was in a social event, and it was a lady who was the daughter of somebody who. Some kind of relations, and then she lived in Livingston, and she was the one that told me the story, but I have lost contact since. So, but I have meant to follow up, so I'll see if I can find more about it.
I'll be doing some digging around, but yeah, if you find anything else out now, please feel free to share with us.
I will.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, like Ayo said, we're almost at time, and again, let me just. Give another shout out to Ayo. Thank you so much. Right, we got two more. My abandonment issues, Ayo. We have two more times with you, so just want to put it out there. But yes, so all of the recordings, all the agenda, and all the PDFs that Ayo provides will live in our website for a year. And please contact us, or if you are going to use it, that would be great. It'll be wonderful to share that on how you're using this curriculum to enhance, to share, to expand, right? And so for me, I have taken bits and pieces, IO, and it has to start at home, right? Like, hey, just let you know, here's what's happening, right? So that's my commitment, is starting my conversation at home, and then hopefully the ripple goes out. But again, I just want to thank you, everyone. It's on the chat, and then of course always on the website of the upcoming Seminar 6 and Seminar 7. So again, thank you so much. And if you can give me until Friday to mash up the recording,
Yes.
The recording will be available.
Okay, just let me know so I don't bug you.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.